The air in the subterranean parking garage hung stale and heavy, thick with the acrid tang of exhaust and damp concrete. It was the kind of air that clung to the back of your throat, thick and unshakable. For me, it was the smell of being hunted. Blinding camera strobes ripped through the dim space, warping it into a flickering nightmare, while a cacophony of shutter clicks and shouted questions bounced off the cold concrete walls. They had me pinned against the frigid metal of my sedan, a mob of so-called fans whose adoration had curdled into something suffocating and violently possessive. One of them, a man with wild, fever-bright eyes, lunged forward, his hand outstretched toward a lock of my hair. I flinched, bracing for the unwelcome contact, but it never landed. A figure cut through the chaos with an unsettling, unshakable calm. She was not tall or physically imposing, but she moved with a ruthless economy of motion that commanded every inch of space around her. One hand closed around the man's wrist with a quiet, unyielding pressure that forced him to recoil with a sharp gasp. With her other arm, she forged an unbreakable barrier between me and the surging crowd, her body a solid, immovable shield. She said not a single word. She did not need to. Her eyes, the color of rain-soaked slate, did all the work. They did not merely look. They assessed, cataloged, and neutralized every threat in a single, sweeping glance. She cleared a path to my car door with the same dispassionate, surgical precision a surgeon uses for a critical incision. The roar of the crowd seemed to fade, muted by the sheer force of her silent, unbreakable will. The moment I was safely inside, the door slammed shut with a heavy, final thud, sealing me in a bubble of abrupt, deafening quiet. She slid into the driver's seat, her knuckles white where they gripped the steering wheel, and navigated the winding labyrinth of the garage without a single word. As the garish neon lights of the city streaked across the windshield, I stared at her sharp, steady profile. In that moment, still buzzing with adrenaline and overwhelming relief, I recognized a kind of strength I had only ever read about in scripts. "I don't just want you to drive for me," I said, my voice still unsteady, frayed at the edges by lingering adrenaline. "I want to hire you. For this. For full-time protection." She met my gaze in the rearview mirror, held it for a long, weighted beat, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Our days quickly settled into a rhythm dictated by early call times and backbreaking shooting schedules. My life was a non-stop performance, a whirlwind of manufactured emotions, memorized lines, and polite smiles that rarely reached my eyes. Her life, from what I could glean, was a masterclass in quiet observation. She became my silent shadow, a constant, unshakable reassuring presence in a world built on smoke and mirrors. She learned my smallest habits with a precision that bordered on uncanny. A steaming coffee, black with 1 sugar, would be waiting in the cup holder after a brutal 4 a.m. wrap. A thick wool blanket would materialize on the back seat when a frigid desert night shoot sent a chill seeping deep into my bones. Her car became my sanctuary. The scent of clean leather and the faint, almost undetectable whiff of mint from the gum she chewed on long drives became inextricably linked to safety. While I was on set, delivering lines under the searing glare of studio lights, she would wait, sometimes for hours on end, reading paperback novels with cracked, well-loved spines, or simply watching the world pass by with that same unwavering stillness. She never pried, never asked about industry gossip or the petty on-set dramas that consumed most of my co-stars. She existed in a constant state of hypervigilance, a guardian at the gates of my chaotic, unmoored life. But she herself remained an impenetrable fortress, a complete and total mystery. Any attempt I made at small talk about her life was met with a polite but firm redirection back to my own safety. I knew her name and nothing more. She was a ghost who kept me safe. The first crack in her stoic, unbreakable facade appeared in the cold blue glow of her phone. We were parked on a quiet side street, waiting for the assistant director to radio me in for my next scene. The car was wrapped in darkness, the engine off, the only sound the distant, low hum of the city beyond. Her phone, left face up on the dashboard, began to vibrate. It was no gentle buzz. It was a vicious, insistent pulse, like a trapped, enraged insect beating against glass. I glanced over without meaning to. The screen lit up with a rapid string of messages, all from a single contact. Husband. They were not words of affection. They were venomous demands. Where is the money? You think you can just ignore me? Answer your phone now. I watched her hand, resting loosely on her knee, clench into a tight, white-knuckled fist. She reached over with a sharp, almost violent movement and flipped the phone face down, plunging the car back into total darkness. She thought I had not seen. But in that brief flash of light, I had seen far more than the cruel words on the screen. I had seen the faint shake of her hand, the rigid tightening of her jaw, the way her carefully constructed mask of neutrality had slipped, revealing a deep, bone-deep weariness and pain beneath. A cold, unsettling realization washed over me. The woman who shielded me from the world's monsters was being hunted by one in her own home. The weight of my career hung over me like a physical burden. The director of my film, a powerful man whose name could open every door in Hollywood, had grown fixated on controlling my every move. He had demanded I rewrite my core character arc to align with his own creative vision, stripping the role of the depth and meaning that had made me fight for it in the first place. When I refused, his praise curdled into thinly veiled threats. He began to hint that my continued hold on the leading role, the very part one had spent years fighting to earn, depended on my willingness to fall in line with his every demand. The unspoken threat of professional ruin hung in the air of every conversation, thick and suffocating. At a high-stakes industry gala, a glittering affair where careers were made and broken over flutes of champagne, he cornered me near the empty terrace. The roar of the party faded into a distant hum as he stepped into my space, his voice a low, menacing murmur, his breath sharp with expensive whiskey. He laid out an ultimatum: comply with his demands, or he would see to it that I was blacklisted from every major studio in town. I felt that familiar, cold panic rise in my chest, the sickening feeling of being trapped with no way out. And then she was there. I had not heard her approach. She moved with the silent precision of a shadow, stepping between us under the guise of handing me a glass of water. It was not an overtly aggressive move, but it was unignorable. She had become an impenetrable physical barrier between us. She did not even glance at him, but she did not need to. Her presence alone shifted the entire atmosphere. The director, a man who could command a set of hundreds with a single word, faltered. He straightened his tie, forced a tight, dismissive smile, and retreated back into the throng of the party. She had said nothing, done nothing outwardly hostile, but her steady, unwavering gaze was a warning that even the most powerful men in this gilded industry seemed to instinctively understand. One morning, as she adjusted the rearview mirror, the cuff of her long-sleeved shirt slid up just a single inch. It was more than enough. On the pale skin of her forearm, just below her wrist, was a constellation of deep purple and bruised blue. It was not the clean, defined bruise of a sparring session or training accident. This was mottled and raw, the kind of mark left by a forceful, enraged grip. The sight of it ignited a white-hot, protective fury in my chest. It felt like a personal insult. This woman, my constant protector, was being hurt, and the injustice of it sat bitter and heavy in my throat. Later that day, I tried to breach the walls she had built. "If you ever need anything," I began, my voice softer than I had intended, "a place to stay, or anything at all, you can tell me." Her eyes, which I had only ever seen sharp and laser-focused, turned guarded and opaque, like windows shuttered tight. She did not respond, only gave a faint shake of her head, as if swatting away an inconsequential fly. The fortress walls went up, higher and thicker than ever before. Her silence was not just quiet, it was a void. A frustrated, bitter judgment began to fester inside me. How could someone so strong, so capable of defending me from every threat, be so unable to defend herself? I began to see her silence, not as strength, but as weakness, a quiet resignation to her fate. The tension between us stretched taut over the next week, a silent, thrumming wire ready to snap. My frustration, fueled by ignorance and a helpless, burning anger, finally broke. After a brutal 16-hour shoot that ended with a demeaning, public tirade from the same director, I climbed into the car, emotionally raw and completely drained. She handed me a cold bottle of water, her usual quiet gesture of care, and something inside me shattered. "I don't understand you," I said, the words spilling out sharp and accusatory before I could stop them. "How can you watch my back every single day, shield me from every threat, and then go home to that? To him? Can't you see what he's doing to you?" She kept her eyes fixed firmly on the road, her hands steady on the wheel. Her unbroken silence only stoked my anger higher. "You're not a victim," I pushed, my voice rising with every word. You're choosing this. He hurts you, drains you of every cent you earn, and you just take it. If you're not willing to save yourself, no one else can. The words were cruel, born from a place of fear and a total, profound misunderstanding of her reality. I wanted her to yell, to defend herself, to show me the same fire she used to protect me. Instead, she simply pulled the car over to the curb, the engine idling softly in the quiet night. She turned to look at me, and in the dim, orange glow of the streetlights, I saw that her eyes were red-rimmed. There was no anger on her face, only a weary, bone-deep sadness that seemed to carve years into her features. She said not a single word. The silence that filled the car that night was heavier and more suffocating than any screaming argument could ever have been. We had become strangers again. My professional world imploded overnight. It began as a tiny trickle on anonymous gossip blogs, then erupted into a full-blown media firestorm. It was a smear campaign, so vicious and meticulously calculated it left me reeling. Private photos from my earliest, most naive days in the industry were leaked online. Stories, twisted into unrecognizable caricatures of the truth, painted me as unstable, unprofessional, and a toxic liability to every production. I was being blackmailed by an anonymous source who demanded an exorbitant sum of money I could never hope to pay in exchange for making the chaos stop. My agent's calls grew less and less frequent. The studio executive stopped taking my calls entirely. I felt completely, utterly alone. The quiet sentinel in the driver's seat had become nothing more than a driver. The space between us was a frozen tundra of unspoken words and broken trust. Our argument had shattered the fragile bond we had built. I was convinced she saw me now, the same way I had seen her, a lost cause. The silence in the car was no longer comforting, it was cold and accusatory. I was spiraling, watching the career I had clawed and fought for years to build disintegrate into dust, and the one person whose presence had once felt like an anchor was now just another stranger paid to do a job. 2 days into the media onslaught, I hit my breaking point. I decided to fire her. It was too agonizing to sit beside her in that suffocating silence, a constant reminder of my own cruelty and failure. I went to the production office late that night, intending to pull her contact information from my personnel files, only to find the door slightly ajar. A single desk lamp cut a sharp cone of warm light through the thick darkness. And there she was. She was hunched over a laptop, her face illuminated by the cold blue glow of the screen, her eyes bloodshot with crippling exhaustion. For a split second, I thought she was clearing out her things, preparing to walk away. But then I saw the screen. It was filled with encrypted forums, detailed data logs, and real-time IP address trackers. It looked like a military command center. She had not been ignoring me. She had barely slept. She had been hunting. It's not an anonymous source, she said, her voice rough and raspy from days of little sleep, not even turning to look at me. She had known I was there the entire time. Of course she had. It's a coordinated attack. My systems traced the initial leak back to a server registered to your co-star's publicist. The blackmail emails are routed through a proxy, but the source code bears the digital signature of the director's production company. She had never abandoned me. While I had been wallowing in self-pity and judging her for choices I did not understand, she had been fighting a war for me in the shadows. I stood there, speechless, the full weight of my own cruel words crashing down on me. Why? I finally managed to choke out. After everything I said to you. She finally turned from the screen, and the exhaustion in her eyes was so profound it hit me like a physical blow. Because it's my job, she said simply. But I knew there was more to it. That's not the only reason. I pressed, stepping further into the circle of lamplight. She let out a long, slow breath, the kind that carries the weight of years of unspoken suffering. My husband, she began, her voice flat and empty of emotion, is a degenerate gambler. He owes massive sums of money to violent, dangerous people. A few months ago, he figured out who I worked for. He realized you were my greatest vulnerability. My blood turned to ice in my veins. He started taking photos, she continued, following you, documenting your every schedule and movement. He gathered every scrap of information he could find. He told me that if I ever tried to leave him, if I ever stopped giving him the money he demanded, he would sell every last one of your secrets to the highest bidder. He would tell them where you live, when you were alone and unprotected. He threatened to hurt you. She looked at me then, and for the first time, I saw the full, staggering scope of her sacrifice. She had not stayed with him, out of weakness. She had endured his violence and his threats to act as a human shield between me and the danger he had created. My safety had been bought with her bruises. My judgment had been a luxury, purchased with her unspoken pain. The guilt was a physical thing, a sickening weight in the pit of my stomach. But beneath it, a new feeling took root, a cold, unbreakable resolve. The world had always seen us as two separate entities, the fragile Hollywood starlet and the silent, stoic bodyguard. They were about to learn how devastatingly wrong they were. Girls Help Girls was not some hollow, trendy inspirational quote. It was a pact. It was a battle plan. I pulled up a chair beside her in the dim office light. "Okay," I said, my voice steady and unshakable for the first time in days. "We're done playing defense. We attack." The dynamic between us shifted in an instant. We were no longer employer and employee. We were equals. We were partners. My resources, the money I had spent years saving, the connections I had forged, however tenuous, became our resources. Her skills, her brilliant tactical mind, her mastery of digital forensics, her unwavering calm under the most extreme pressure, became our weapons. The first call I made was to the most ruthless litigation attorney in the state, a woman legendary for dismantling abusive men and corrupt corporations. I put her on a retainer that made my business manager sputter with shock. The nights that followed were a blur of caffeine and relentless strategy. My apartment became a war room, the walls covered in detailed timelines, connection maps, and legal roadmaps. We were two soldiers in a foxhole, preparing to fight our way out, together. We moved with a surgical precision that left no room for error. While my legal team quietly filed for an emergency protective order against her husband, citing years of extortion and domestic violence, she and I worked tirelessly on the second front. She compiled the digital evidence she had unearthed into an airtight, irrefutable file, proof that the director and my rival co-star had conspired to illegally obtain and distribute my private information, in a clear case of premeditated professional sabotage and blackmail. I did my part. I used my platform. I gave an exclusive interview to a single, respected investigative journalist, not to play the victim, but to seize control of the narrative. I did not mention her husband or her private struggles. I laid out the full, unredacted evidence of the coordinated, professional attack against me, framing it as a symptom of the toxic, power-hungry culture that poisoned the entire industry. This was no longer just about me. It was about exposing a system that preyed on anyone who dared to stand up for themselves. Simultaneously, we gathered our own leverage against her husband. She uncovered irrefutable evidence of his illegal gambling rings, his long history of violence, and his extensive web of debt to dangerous criminal entities. We were not just building a defense. We were dismantling his entire world, brick by brick. The confrontation with her husband did not happen in a screaming match, but in the sterile, unforgiving silence of a lawyer's office. He arrived arrogant and cocky, expecting to intimidate her into submission the way he always had. Instead, he found the two of us waiting for him, flanked by our legal team. He saw me and sneered, assuming I was nothing more than a bystander, a pretty prop for show. But when our lawyer began to calmly lay out the irrefutable evidence, photographs of her injuries, bank statements detailing years of extortion, sworn affidavits from witnesses to his threats, and a filed copy of the restraining order that now barred him from coming within 500 feet of either of us, the color drained completely from his face. I stood behind her chair, my hand resting firmly on her shoulder, a mirror of the countless times she had stood between me and danger. For the first time, I saw the complete absence of fear in her eyes when she looked at him. She did not have to say a single word. Her stillness, her unshakable resolve, was her victory. He crumpled, not with a bang, but a whimper, when he realized every ounce of power he had held over her was gone, evaporated into thin air. He was no longer a monster. He was just a pathetic, desperate man, exposed fully to the light. We walked out of that office into the bright, unfiltered afternoon sun, and she took her first, deep breath as a free woman. Our work was not finished. True freedom was not just about removing the threat, it was about rebuilding the foundation that threat had destroyed. Her husband had controlled her for years by weaponizing her family's most urgent needs. So, we systematically stripped him of that leverage, one piece at a time. I used my industry network to connect her younger brother with a reputable trade school and a guaranteed paid apprenticeship, giving him a stable, secure path away from the precarious, dead-end jobs he had been forced to take. We found a top-tier medical facility specializing in her mother's chronic condition, arranged for her immediate transfer, and covered every single cost her insurance refused to pay. We secured them a small, bright, safe apartment in a quiet, well-protected neighborhood. It was an investment in her peace of mind, a debt I could never fully repay. I will never forget the day we moved her mother into the new care facility. As we stood in the quiet, sunlit room, she watched her mother sleep peacefully for the first time in months. I saw her shoulders, which she had always held so ramrod straight, rigid with the weight of her burden, finally drop. It was a subtle shift, a barely perceptible release of a weight she had carried for so long it had become a part of her. In that quiet, sacred moment, I understood that protecting each other meant more than just fending off attacks. It meant tending to the roots, ensuring the ground beneath our feet was solid enough for both of us to stand on. The fallout in the industry was swift and unforgiving. Faced with irrefutable evidence and the threat of a massive, career-ruining lawsuit, the director was quietly fired by the studio, his upcoming project scrapped overnight. My rival co-star's career was irreparably tarnished by the scandal, her carefully crafted reputation shredded beyond repair. The smear campaign against me did not just end. It reversed completely. The narrative shifted overnight. I was no longer the volatile, unprofessional starlet the tabloids had painted me as. I was a woman of principle who had weathered a brutal storm and exposed the industry's deep-seated corruption. My agency, which had been ready to drop me only weeks before, was now hailing me as a symbol of resilience and courage. We returned to the set to finish the film, but everything was different. We were a single, formidable unit. She was no longer just my driver or bodyguard. She was my chief of security, my most trusted confidant and advisor. Her presence was a silent, unignorable declaration. The whispers in the hallways, the sidelong glances, the power plays, and petty cruelties, they all ceased entirely. The industry, a world that preys on perceived weakness, had learned a new language, the language of unbreakable solidarity. They knew that to get to me, they would have to go through her. And they knew that to get to her, they would have to face me. We had drawn a line in the sand, and we stood on it, side by side. The story does not end with a dramatic, explosive climax, but on a quiet evening months later. We stood on the balcony of my new apartment, overlooking the sprawling, glittering carpet of the city lights below. The air was crisp and cool, and we sat in a comfortable silence that felt hard-earned, sacred. There were no grand speeches of gratitude, no dramatic declarations of lifelong devotion. There did not need to be. Everything that needed to be said had already been said, in late-night strategy sessions, in shared cups of coffee at dawn, in the simple, unwavering act of showing up for each other when the world had tried to break us both. We had walked through our respective hells and pulled each other from the flames. Her scars were a permanent reminder of her unshakable resilience. My restored career was a testament to her unwavering loyalty and courage. We were two women from vastly different worlds, bound not by blood or legal obligation, but by a shared, intimate understanding of what it means to fight for someone, to protect someone, to choose someone, when the world has given you every reason to look away. I looked at her, her profile soft and serene against the glittering skyline, and I knew I was looking at the truest form of family I had ever known. We were each other's keepers. We were safe. And we were finally completely free.